Now go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 71, and today we're going to be asking, was the ending of Mark's Gospel lost? One of the great mysteries of the New Testament is why does Mark's Gospel end the way that it does? I mean, what happens is you have the story of the empty tomb in Mark, but you don't have any stories about any resurrection appearances. So the women arrive at the tomb early on the Sunday morning, on what we would call Easter Sunday, and they find the tomb already empty with the stone rolled away. And then they see this young man in white who tells them that Jesus is risen, that he's gone ahead of them to Galilee, and that these women are to go and tell Peter and the other disciples about what has happened. And then, rather bizarrely, instead of us seeing the women going back and telling the disciples, or themselves witnessing Jesus, we just have the line that they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that's how the gospel ends. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. It's really bizarre because we're used to Matthew's resurrection story, where you have the narration of the empty tomb, and then as the women depart from the tomb, they meet the risen Jesus. Or Luke's story, where we have several appearances after the empty tomb story to different disciples. Or John's narrative, in which Jesus himself appears to Mary Magdalene on her own at the tomb on Easter morning. So what is going on in Mark? Why is it so radically different from the other Gospels? And most importantly, is there something missing? Did Mark's Gospel originally have more to it than just this abrupt ending at 16 verse 8? I should, however, back up a minute though, because no doubt some people, as they're listening, as they're looking at the New Testament, they'll be saying, hold on a minute, but my Bible's got a little ending of Mark. It's got verses 9 to 20. It doesn't end at 16 verse 8. And that, of course, is true. And the vast majority of manuscripts of Mark's Gospel do have this ending of Mark, which is in modern Bibles in verses 9 to 20. The best modern Bibles, though, what they'll do is they'll demarcate that section with a little comment and note that longer ending does not appear in every manuscript of Mark's Gospel. And indeed, it's one of these really fascinating phenomena that a couple of our early and really good, reliable Greek witnesses don't actually have that longer ending. So Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, neither of those has Mark 16 verses 9 to 20. They just stop at 16 verse 8. So yes, there are thousands of texts that contain it, but early, reliable Greek manuscripts lack it. And most scholars have thought that it would be easier to explain a scribe adding that resurrection appearance tradition in verses 9 to 20 on than someone omitting it. Why would you omit something that's apparently as important as the resurrection stories? Plus, when you look at 16, 9 to 20, it's not really in the style of the rest of Mark's Gospel. It's really different. You notice a complete gear change between verses 8 and 9. Moreover, in terms of content, what Mark 16, 9 to 20 looks like is a kind of a later, almost a conflation of material that you see in other resurrection stories like in Matthew and Luke. So the vast majority of modern scholars think that the longer ending of Mark, the last 12 verses of Mark, are not in fact from the pen of the person that wrote the rest of the Gospel. They are a later addition to conform Mark's Gospel a bit more closely to the other canonical Gospels, Matthew, Luke and John. But if those verses aren't from the hand of Mark the Evangelist, then what is going on at the end of Mark's Gospel? I mean, Matthew and Luke, who use Mark's Gospel, and I'm with the majority, as regular listeners will know, in thinking that Matthew and Luke use Mark's Gospel, Matthew and Luke clearly didn't like the ending of Mark's Gospel there, because they both add their own separate resurrection accounts afterwards. For many years, people just assumed that maybe the ending of Mark's Gospel was lost. Maybe the original manuscript, maybe even the autograph, just got ripped off somehow at the bottom. And one of the things that people would say here is that it's a very strange way for anyone to end a book by just saying, "for they were afraid." It's such a sort of anticlimax of an ending. And so lots of scholars used to say, then maybe the ending of Mark, the original ending of Mark, was simply lost. And it's even stranger in Greek than it is in English translations, because the actual last word in Mark's Gospel is a conjunction. It's the word "for." In the phrase, "for they were afraid," in Greek that conjunction comes at the end, "for." So it actually ends on a conjunction. So would any good literary author actually end their work in this rather strange way? It's a view, this idea that Mark's Gospel has somehow been mutilated, that's recently received a bit of new life from a scholar called Clayton Croy, who wrote a book called The Mutilation of Mark's Gospel. And he goes back to this older view that the original ending of Mark's Gospel was lost somehow. Somehow it got ripped out. And already when you get to Matthew and Luke they've already seen this kind of mutilated version of Mark. They haven't got access to the original lost ending. So this must have happened pretty early on. And one of the things that Croy points out is that you do have these prophecies of the resurrection in Mark's Gospel. So it's not as if Mark doesn't set up an expectation that the resurrected Jesus will be appearing to his disciples. I must admit, I remember as an undergraduate student, being fascinated by this question. I really found it intriguing and mysterious to wonder, could there have been an ending that was somehow lost? And one of the pivotal moments for me in my reading was looking at a scholar called R.H. Lightfoot, who I thought convincingly argued that 16 verse 8 does work as a coherent ending to Mark's Gospel. Stylistically, even though it's a rather strange way to end the book, it does actually make sense. So the "for they were afraid," it doesn't require an argument of a lost ending. You might still want to argue for a lost ending, but Lightfoot argued that it doesn't really require that kind of theory. So could it be then that Mark intended to end the book at 16 verse 8? That's the way that the majority now of New Testament scholars argue on this, and I should say, I'm not saying it's convincing because the majority say it. I have lots of minority opinions myself, but I'm just saying that for point of reference, so you realise what the dominant view in New Testament scholarship is. But most scholars think that Mark's Gospel did intentionally end at 16 verse 8, and contemporary New Testament scholars tend rather to like Mark's ending. Part of that is that New Testament scholars, being a rather difficult bunch a lot of the time, like the idea that they have seen something that many of the punters across history haven't seen. So lots of New Testament scholars like to say Mark is dark, enigmatic, mysterious, and they love that kind of enigmatic, mysterious ending. And so they rather celebrate Mark's unusual ending there. And I have to say, I think there is something in that view. I mean, after all, Mark is the gospel where you continually have Jesus saying to people, don't tell anyone about me. And so if any gospel is going to have people being quiet at the end, then it's Mark's gospel. And there's something so utterly mysterious and strange about Mark's gospel, and it has a passion narrative that is so dark and full of dramatic irony, that again, if any gospel is going to end in this rather bizarre fashion, it's going to be Mark's gospel. And I rather like the way that the empty tomb story in Mark functions to really take the reader back to the beginning of the story again, because the young man at the empty tomb says that the women and the disciples will see Jesus in Galilee. Well, Mark is really keen on Galilee, constantly mentions Galilee as a really key area in Jesus' life. So maybe what Mark's gospel is doing is encouraging us to go back to the beginning of the gospel and start again. I've always rather liked works that bookend things with the same material, where you get to the end of the work and it takes you back. I mean, one of my favourite TV series of all time, The Prisoner, which was made in the late 1960s, 1966 and 67, that actually ends, and I'm afraid this is a slight spoiler for anyone that's not seen the series, not too big a spoiler, a slight spoiler, that actually ends with the same shot that you have at the very beginning of the series. You see Patrick McGoohan as the prisoner doing exactly the same thing, driving his Lotus 7 in that last shot of the entire series, which is also the same as the very first shot of the entire series. So maybe Mark's doing something like that, and he's taking the reader back to Galilee, back on a journey to Galilee, saying, reread the gospel, and this time you will understand it differently. This time you'll get fresh inspiration as you read it a second time. What I suppose slightly gives me pause, though, about the New Testament scholars who say, isn't Mark brilliant, isn't he inspired, isn't this kind of dark and enigmatic and exciting and all the rest of it, is that they are the only people really in history, New Testament scholars are, who think that the ending of Mark's Gospel is as brilliant as this. The vast majority of people across the centuries have not been satisfied with the end of Mark's Gospel, including all of those scribes who added the longer ending, which, as I said, is the vast majority of manuscripts of Mark. And Matthew and Luke, who add material to the end of Mark's Gospel. John doesn't have this abrupt ending either. So most people in history have not found Mark's Gospel at all satisfactory. And in fact, if you even go and view oral performances of Mark's Gospel by people like Max McLean or various other ones that you can see online, you'll see that they too go on with the longer ending, with verses 9 to 20. So that, I think, should give us a little pause. Sometimes maybe New Testament scholars are just a bit too clever for their own good. Maybe we're actually seeing things that aren't there. Maybe the ending isn't this kind of literary masterpiece that we like to pretend it is. I've sometimes toyed with the idea, and I'm not wanting to put this forward in a major way and throw my weight behind it, but I've sometimes toyed with the idea, which is something that you almost never see in New Testament scholarship, which is that there is a possibility, there's a different view here to the idea that Mark intentionally ended the Gospel at 16 verse 8, or that the ending is lost. And this is that Mark's Gospel is basically unfinished. It's a work that the author never really got round to composing the end of. And let me illustrate what I mean. There are several great literary masterpieces that are in fact unfinished. One of the most famous, Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. It's only got a couple of movements. It's his 8th symphony. He didn't die suddenly. He wasn't suddenly arrested when he got halfway through it. He just never completed it. I mean, there's a Symphony Number 9, which is complete, the Great C Major, but his Symphony Number 8 is unfinished. Could Mark's Gospel be like that? I must admit, whenever I think of Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, I'm always reminded of an advertisement, a beer advert, which I used to see in my youth. I'm guessing it dates back to the 1970s or perhaps early 80s. And it was a Kronenberg advert, and basically a bunch of Schubert's friends come round and invite him out for a beer. And he says, look, I'm working on my Unfinished Symphony. But then they persuade him, and he goes to the pub with them. They have a drink, and at the end of the advert they say, Schubert, what about your Unfinished Symphony? And he says, what about my Unfinished Kronenberg? And I kind of like the idea that Mark's Gospel perhaps is a little bit like that. Perhaps he just didn't actually get around to finishing it. I mean, there's another great example, which is Coleridge and Kubla Khan. There's this famous story which Coleridge told about the visitor from Porlock arriving, and it meant that he was unable to complete the poem because he never quite got the inspiration back. Was there a visitor from Porlock that arrived as Mark was composing the end of his Gospel, and he never had the inspiration to finish the thing off? Perhaps something like that happened. If that is the case, then it's one of those cases, a bit like with Coleridge, a bit like with Schubert, where the unfinished work is itself an invitation to all of those literary artists subsequent to Mark who have done things with his ending. So right from Matthew to Luke to John to the scribes that had the longer ending, people are constantly trying to finish Mark's Gospel, trying to add something to it. And that probably is one of the reasons why we keep going back to Mark's Gospel and reading it and rereading it, because it still asks us this difficult, enigmatic, challenging question about what kind of book it is. Well, thanks for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com. You can get me on iTunes or Duke University's iTunes U. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook at NT Pod or Twitter NT Pod 2. thanks for listening. It's always great to have your company, and I look forward to being along again soon with another episode. Bye-bye.
Here, Schubert, what about your unfinished symphony?
What about my unfinished Kronenberg, huh?